3, 2, 1.
All right. So here we are at this auspicious time to be alive. 5, 6, or 26,000 years that it took for another moment like this to happen. Essentially, at a time that has never been experienced before in modern recorded history. Yeah, and it's like kind of mind-boggling, right? I think that's sort of the source of some of these funny movie images that Brett was putting. Oh, the world's going to end and stuff, because it's mind-boggling to think that we're experiencing something that no human being that we know of through writing, through recorded history, has ever gone through before. So what do we do with that? What in the world do we do with that? Well, astrology actually offers some really concrete tools to answer that question. So that's what I'm gonna try to bring. We're gonna go through this theme of the above and the below, if you will, a lot. Brett touched on that several times in his, and if I may, I'm going to try to be the below to Brett's above, and I'm going to try to bring it down with some practical skills, some basic astrology, basic alchemy, basic magic that can help us to use this galactic time to transform ourselves and transform our lives, and maybe even our world. So, we have this galactic alignment with the winter solstice, and at the moment we also have this great gas giant planet Saturn in the galactic core. You can see here's Saturn, right on the edge, right on the banks of this great river of stars that is called, and you can see them reflecting here in the waters below. So as above, so below. We have this Saturn alignment, which is about every 29 years. It last happened in the late 80s when the Berlin Wall was coming down and things were changing a lot. It's kind of like an awakening before things start to shift, is the way I see it when I go back and look at it historically. This is my own attempt with not quite as good a camera probably, but you can see Saturn here. This was taken, many of you who are from around here will notice this profile. It's Bell Rock. Here's Saturn in this galactic core. So there's a spiritual energy, there's a vortex energy, right? The vortex that is the center of our galaxy, coming to meet this Earth vortex energy, as above, so below, in this moment as we're here, and really for the next year. As Brett said earlier, the Saturn will be back here at this point again in December this year. And here's another star trail that I took. So we've got this above vortex and this below vortex, and how do they meet? And how can we bring them together into that sacred marriage and perform that alchemy of making this energy real in our lives? So it's always fun to invoke Morpheus here. What if I told you that as above, so below is even less than half the story? This is a misquote, really. It's not nearly that simple. The source of this saying is something called the Emerald Tablet. It's an ancient cryptic document. It's very short and dense, and yet it tells the entire story of the creation of the world and the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. So it's kind of an amazing document. It's part of a group of documents that are called the Hermetic, which is a group of Greek-Egyptian. It's kind of a melding of the Greek-Egyptian traditions. And they're basically Gnostic texts. They promote Gnosticism is a kind of spiritual knowing. It's a knowing through your higher mind, your spiritual mind, yeah? And these were basically attributed to the great Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice great. So this tradition is where the astrology that I practice comes from. And if we look at what this document actually says, and again, it depends on how you translate it, but roughly what it says is that which is above corresponds with that which is below. So there's a correspondence, right? And that which is below corresponds with that which is above. So there's a two-way correspondence. It's not above, below. It's not on earth as in heaven. It's going both ways, right? There's a co-creation that's being implied here to work the miracles of the one. And later in the same document refers to the above and below again. It says it rises from earth to heaven so as to draw the lights of the heights into itself. Thus within it are the forces of the above and the below. So there's a combination of these two vortexes, the above vortex and the below vortex, and these energies are contained within it, which it is the philosopher's stone that he's talking about, and or the master who is capable of creating the philosopher's stone. And we have pictures of what these masters look like, and you'll notice that he's holding a globe, right? But it's not just any globe. And he's combining the powers of the above and the below, the solar and lunar, the yin and yang. This is another picture similar. You can see in Latin it says here, Code est superius, what is above, is the same as Code est inferius, that which is below. And there's a symbol for Mercury there. So you can see here, the master is making this above and below that happened in the beginning of creation. This sacred connection happened within himself. Oh yes, the lights. Rule number 2. Now, speaking of this above and below with respect to creation, there's another document in the Hermetica that's very instructive about how the universe came to be. It's essentially like the genesis of Hermeticism, if you will. So there's a vision of creation that is revealed to the Gnostic disciple from the one mind, or this one that Brett was talking about, if you just want to call it the one. Some people call it the one mind because it's an above principle. At first, in the beginning, here was not darkness. Remember, in the Bible, in the beginning, darkness was on the face of the deep. In the beginning, there was nothing but light. The darkness came from out of the light. And then the darkness transmutes, and the darkness comes from above in the light and begins to sink, begins to come. So there's a correspondence between the above and the below. And this darkness transmutes into three different things. There's a fiery part of it, there's a watery part of it, and there's just the dark part of it. And from this threefold thing, which is basically nature as we would call it, emanates a cry or a vibration, a tone, a primordial yearning for the light. So the darkness and the light are separated, and yet they yearn for each other. They call out to each other. It's really a beautiful, beautiful story. If you ever get a chance, it's called The Divine Pymander, and it's really worth a read. It's a little hard, cryptic, but once you get past that, it's really beautiful. So there's this correspondence between the above and the below, you see. So, as his dark counterpart, or I say his because I'm talking about yang, but it's not necessarily male or female. But as the dark counterpart is calling out to the light counterpart, there's the light answers, and the dark, moist, fiery nature is injected with the holy word, with the logos, with the sort of masculine principle of light, of reason, of logos, so that nature becomes impregnated with this light. So the two are now one. This immediately affects an ordering of these three pre-cosmological elements, if you will, into the elements that we know in astrology: fire, air, and water, earth. It's interesting to note here that nature saw this word in the fire and air aspects, the above elements, but could only hear it in the water and earth part of it. So there's a difference in the experience between above and below that's being talked about here. We're going to go through that in much more detail later on. So this is kind of a graphical representation. In the beginning, there was this one mass that came out of the light, and it divided into these three. In alchemy, we call these salt, which is just sort of the material matrix of something. It's sort of like the cellular structure of something. Mercury is the sort of cellular fluid of the thing. If this is the cell walls, this is the ectoplasm or whatever is in the. And the sulfur is the sort of fiery principle of that animates, that gives it life. Okay, and from these three things come the downward tending elements and the upward tending elements. You'll notice that the sword and the chalice are invoked here. So fire and air tend to move up, water and earth tend to move down. And if anybody has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand or just speak out. This is pretty basic stuff for somebody like me that's been doing this for 25 years, but it's still pretty. It's a lot for somebody who hasn't done it for that long. So from this union of God and nature, if you will, comes a second outpouring of mind, and this is what's known as, some people call it the great architect. If you get into the Matrix, the dude that Neo meets at the end, that's the architect. It's not God, actually. He's going to meet, when they say you're going to meet your maker, in Gnosticism or in Hermeticism, you're going to meet this second thing. That is the intermediary between you and God. That is the creator, fashioner of souls, the demiurge. And the demiurge differentiates itself into 7 different archetypes, which we know as the planets. And these are basically subtle matter endowed with reason. In other words, for the Hermeticists, base matter is not intelligent in terms of what they were thinking of as intelligence. I mean, we all know that crystals have their own intelligence, but it's not the same kind of intelligence as human intelligence in terms of like speaking and philosophizing and so forth. But the planets are endowed with this same kind of reason as we are, essentially. And they enclose the cosmos. So they are also the engines of fashioning souls. So our souls are made from and of the planets, the 7 planetary principles. Then there's a third outpouring from this union of the demiurge with these 7 principles. There's a third outpouring, and this is humans. And actually, it's a little bit of a side point, but in the beginning, according to this text, humans were not in meat suits, or as Brett said earlier, monkey suits. They were like fire and air. They were light beings, and only later did they become embodied. And so that's an interesting thing to think when you hear people talking about ascension. If we were originally light beings and then we became embodied, maybe we become light beings again on our way out. It's reasonable to assume with this cosmology, anyways. So human wanted to become one with the archetypal administrators or the planets, and he did. But then he wanted to do more. So he broke through the spheres, and I'll show you this map in a minute, the spheres that are outside the Earth that contain the planets. And he showed himself to nature, and nature in seeing this sight of the first human fell in love, and he with her, and they were as one, as lovers. And this is sort of the fall of man, if you will, you see, because he was this light being, and he fell in love with nature, and that's how he became embodied in the meat suit or monkey suit, if you will. It's beautiful, right? Lovely, lovely story. So there's this literal correspondence. There's this love story between the above and the below. So the result is that even though humans are eternal in spirit, God-like, they are also mortal in body. So those spiritually deathless and possessed of divine authority to create, in fact, sort of with a mandate to create, because that's what God did, and that's what the demiurge did. So presumably that's what we're here to do, is to create, and yet also subject to mortal fate. So we have this eternal nature that is beyond the spheres. It's of the stars, essentially, right? We know that Joni was right. We're made of stardust. All the heavy elements are formed in the last gasp of a star's life, and then spewed across the universe. And that same carbon is in our bodies. It's been recycled over and over and over again. We know the story, right? So we are of stars, and yet we're trapped here in these spheres for now. So what do we do about that? So now, the ascent of souls. So the end of the story is that when we're released from these meat suits and we go back to where we came from, he talks about that you go through these zones. And there's a sort of sin or a mortal shortcoming that is released at each one of these so that we can become light beings again. And so they give basically these different sins to the different planets. And you can see there's an order here. And the order is called the Chaldean order. It's the order of the speed through which the planets move through the sky. The moon moves 13 degrees a day, Mercury about 2, Venus about 1.5, the sun is exactly a degree, Mars is about 3/4 of a degree, Jupiter and Saturn are really slow compared to those. So there's this ascent back through the spheres as we leave this place. And you can see this is actually reflected in the Ptolemaic cosmos, so that basically here we are on Earth, yeah? And then you can see there's the lunar sphere, the mercurial sphere, the Venus sphere, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Up above that we have firmamentu, which means the firmament, the stars, right? Does anybody know what this primum mobile, the prime mover, that's the great architect. So here's the dude that created humans, right, in the image of his creator, or her creator, its creator. And then habiculatum Dei, the dwelling place of God. Okay? So we ascend through these spheres on our way back to God. And the angels meet us somewhere in the middle here, and we hear these beautiful songs. And we know we're back, almost back home.
Gary, have you gone into why the zodiacs aren't aligned, like why the 3 rings aren't divided?
I'm not really going to get into that, but let's just call it precession. They were aware at this point in time. Hipparchus was the Westerner who discovered precession. There's reasons to believe that other people were aware of it long before that, but Hipparchus was aware of it in like 300 BC. So that's the record that we have of it. Now, below the heavenly spheres of the planets, we have fire, air, earth, and water. Remember? Fire and air are the upward facing elements. Earth and water are the downward facing elements. So what this is telling us is that there's basically a density dealio with the elements, right? What does fire do when you give it a spark? It goes up. It always goes up. Fire is the least dense. Plasma would be what the current scientific idea about plasma is very light. It's not very dense. Air is a bit denser. Water a bit denser still. And then, of course, if you throw a stone into water, it sinks. Earth is the densest of the four elements. So once we have an understanding of this density idea, we can begin to understand how these elements work, how they act, what their function is. And we can also begin to understand how they interact because of the way that they're arranged. And this is where the magic and the alchemy comes in. So this is just another, we saw this earlier, division of the elements into the downward tending and upward tending from the one. So this is, I say, pre-visited by Aristotle, because the map I showed you before is actually about 200 AD, and Aristotle was about 200 BC. In his, I prefer the translation on coming to be and passing away, right? So there's this cycle of birth, growth, and decay that is intimated by the elements, and we can understand how that works through these principles of cold and hot and wet and dry, right? Somebody earlier was saying, oh, geez, it's hot in this room, you know? And what does hot do? It makes it hard to sit still, right? Hot is active principle. Cold is stillness. Wet and dry you can think of as wet holds things together, right? If you want to hold a cake batter together, what do? You put some egg and some milk in there, and everything holds together, right? Whereas the red sand is very dry. If you lift it up, it just separates into a bunch of different particles. So these are very sort of Taoist principles that you can see, feel, and touch and taste, and you can really work with. And Aristotle said, look, it's pretty simple. In the spring, the weather is moist, and the spring rains, and then it becomes hot, right? And then later, and after the hotness dries it out, so then it becomes dry, and then the weather becomes cold. So the elements then become the combinations of these two qualities. Water is cold and moist. Air is moist and hot. Fire is hot and dry. Earth is dry and cold. So there's this cycle of transformation through the seasons that is analogous to the cycle of transformation through the four elements, okay? So it's pretty simple. If I want to, for instance, if I want to get warm, I take some earth, I take a couple of sticks, right? If I want to get warm, what do I do with them? I rub them together. Friction, heat. So earth becomes fire by what? Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button there. Earth is dry and cold. If I wanted to turn it into fire, I have to replace the cold with the hot, because fire is hot and dry. See? So there's a transformation through the exchange of one quality for another, and then the element changes from earth to fire. So it's a lot easier to transform between elements that are adjacent. This became known to the alchemists as the square of opposites, because the really hard one, unfortunately, we'll see why in a minute, is between elements that are opposite, right? Because earth is dry and cold. Air is hot and moist. Unlike fire, which is hot and dry, and earth is dry and cold, they share a quality of dry. So you only have to exchange one, and then you get the transformation. But dry and cold, hot and moist, they don't share anything. How do you get from earth to air. Right? We've been after that one for a very long time. Humans finally took flight only 100 years ago. Can you believe it? You know, well, 100 and what, 15 or 114. So that one's harder. And the answer is you have to go through an intermediary stage. So you have to go through water or through fire to become air. We'll get back to this here in a little bit. So in astrology, the 4 elements and the 4 qualities are represented by the signs, right? Everybody's familiar with this. You have the fire signs and the water signs and so forth, right? So notice that Aquarius, which is the age that we're moving towards in the precessional cycle, and Pisces, the age that we're either in or moving out of, air and water. The good news is, for that one, air and water share a quality. They're both moist. So what does water have to do to become air? It's kind of the same deal with Earth becoming fire. It has to heat up. It has to exchange cold, right? Because water is cold and moist. Air is hot and moist. So if you exchange the cold for hot, then you change from water. And what do? When we boil water, right? We add heat, it becomes vapor. It's really simple stuff and really obvious, yeah? I don't think a lot of people know that astrology is that, like, Taoist, that grounded in reality. So this is a little bit more southwestern style of a map of the same thing that I got a little artsy with here. So here you have water, wet and cold. Earth is cold and dry. Fire is hot and dry. Air, hot and wet. So you can begin to see how transforming into adjacent elements is easy. Transforming into opposite elements is a little bit harder because it takes 2 steps. Essentially, you have to transform twice. All right. Everybody with me? Cool. Now we can also think about the qualities in terms of the planets, believe it or not. Basically, what happens when the sun comes up in the morning? Generally speaking, it gets warmer, almost always, and the dew is burned off the grass, right? So it gets drier. The sun is hot and dry, right? If you stay out too long in the sun, you can die because you'll be literally dried out. Whereas the moon, as she's coming out now, the temperatures drop and the dew will come out later. So the moon is cool and moist. These are very obvious principles. With Mars, of course, his problem is that he's a hot-tempered guy, right? That's pretty obvious. And dry in the sense of, as I said, dry is a principle of separation. So what does Mars do? Mars separates the good guys from the bad guys, the infidels from the believers, and yada, 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 right? Venus, on the other hand, says, we're all one, give me a hug, you know? So it's the principle of moistness, togetherness, right? See what I'm saying? So they're archetypal opposites. Now, what planet's missing here? Yes. And why do you think he's missing? He's all of the above. He's the wild card. He can do it all. Hot, cold, wet, moist. Wherever he is, he kind of does whatever. When in Rome, he does what the Romans are doing. Okay? Now, to get back to the main topic here, Jupiter, hot and moist. Saturn is cold and dry. So Jupiter is airy, Saturn is earthy. This is I did a talk about this back when I first got to Asheville with a really good friend of mine. His name is Kelly Lee Phipps, and we put it on YouTube. And one of the viewers wrote in and said, "You guys need a graphic artist because everything you're doing, but you're scribbling it on the blackboard and I can barely read it. Just let me do this for you." And so she made this wonderful diagram. But there's all kinds of keywords that we can use here. Hot basically increases energy. It accelerates. It generates. It brightens, it impassions, it's uplifting. Okay? Dry separates things, it discriminates between things, it analyzes, breaks things down, makes distinctions, and so forth. Okay? Cold is deceleration, rest, conservation of energy, dispassionate, inward, right? Wet is moisturizes, blends, synthesizes, makes connections, bonding. So you can begin to see how these opposite qualities can show up in the planets. So here we have Jupiter is hot and moist, Saturn is cold and dry. So they're archetypal opposites. Later on in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance era, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance era, this became codified as what's called temperaments. So that if we talk about Jupiter as a temperament, we would say that his temperament is sanguine. When I say sanguine, what do you think of?
Blood.
Easygoing, kind of chill, right? What was your?
Sanguinous means blood.
It does mean blood, yeah. But in terms of a verb, to be sanguine is to be pretty chill, pretty, and he's a pretty, he's one of the benefics in astrology. Whereas Saturn is like known as more of a troublesome kind of guy. He's like, very sober and rigid, follow the rules, do your work, right? Okay, so he's the melancholic temperament. So we can see these principles in both the signs and in the planets. Everybody with me? Yeah. All right, now comes the fun part. So Jupiter being the crescent of soul, above the cross of matter, there's this, remember the above and the below, there's this upward tending nature, right? Remember the air element is an upward triangle. So there's this upward, so higher mind, philosophy, travel, international exchange. This would, in economics, this would be the bull cycle, right? Whereas Saturn is contraction, boundary, structure, law. In economics, this would be stability, which is a bear cycle. Now, what's really fascinating when you start studying astrology is these two principles, which are so opposite, come together in the same place in the sky every 20 years. And for the longest time, before we discovered the outermost planets, that was all we knew. So that was the longest cycle that the planets can make. And in fact, some people theorize that there was a rare triple conjunction where they came together, came apart, get together again, apart, and together again, 3 times in the sign of Pisces around 3 BC. That was the Star of David. That was the Star of Bethlehem, the Star of Jesus. In our time, and by the way, they only do it in one element at a time. And this happens for about 200 years. So you got 200 years in one element, 200 years in another. 2 times 4, 800 years it takes for this cycle to complete, roughly. So that the last time, for instance, that we had a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the sign of Aquarius was when Alexander the Great was doing his conquests of, the known world at the time. Yeah. So there was this great, and what is air? Air is hot, right? It's outward moving. So he moved out across the world. But what did he do? He didn't separate out. He didn't say, hey, you've got to stop acting like your culture and adopt ours. He said, go ahead and do your culture. In fact, bring it to Alexandria. Bring all your books. We want all your... So there was this great collection of knowledge that came about because of the Alexandrian... And in fact, this whole system that I'm speaking to you about here today came about because of that Hellenistic era mixing bowl of cultures that was the result of the Alexandrian conquest. That would have been actually 2 cycles ago. The last one was in the Renaissance, which was when all that stuff got renewed. 2 times 800. So what we've had going on here is we've had this 7 conjunctions in Capricorn, Virgo, Taurus. What element am I talking about? Earth. Earth signs. And then we had one in Libra in 1981. Now, anybody got any ideas about how that showed up in our culture, that shift to air? Between 1981 and 2000? The internet, right? Cell phones? Yeah? I didn't talk on a cell phone in the 70s. I didn't know anyone with a cell phone, did you? Yeah. I didn't know anyone with internet, for that matter. So you can begin to see that when this air cycle showed up, there was this great change in the way that the sociocultural energies were being expressed. And then what happened is it doesn't always neatly transition into the air cycle, right? So there was this sort of regression back into Taurus. So then what happened to the internet? It became monetized, right? I was posting one of my pictures of this lovely area the other day that I do in sort of a sacred service as a skykeeper. I know not everyone has the ability to get out to these wonderful places with sky, and so I said, here, let me show you what I'm seeing. And Facebook gives me the opportunity to tag a product with this photo. That's a new deal that they've got going on there. I can tag a product on me.
Wow.
So there's this, my friend in England, Julian Venables, when I was over there, we were talking about this. He says, yeah, since this one is the last one in the earth signs for like 800 years, he says, yeah, it's the last great money grab. It's like the last, I mean, think about it. 1842 through the 1960s, this is essentially capitalism as we know, as a system, yeah? And I don't necessarily want to get into politics too much because honestly, I think that all of that is going to look very different as air is from earth pretty soon, so I don't necessarily want to get hung up on all that, but at the same time, there are some obvious correlations, yeah? Now, does anybody remember what the relationship between air and earth are on the wheel of opposites, on the square of opposites? Are they next to each other? They're opposite each other, yeah? So, earth is cold and dry, air is warm and moist. They don't share a quality. So this is one of those ones where it's going to take 2 transformations to get there. All right?
Which is it moving into for 2020?
Yeah, that's what thank you. I was wondering the same thing. What's that coming up?
Go into the air.
1 degrees Aquarius. And then Libra, Gemini, Aquarius, Libra, Gemini. So this is moving into the airway. Okay? So we're going to have, there's no more Earth conjunctions for like 800 years. That's done. Over. Right? So something here on Earth that was built up in this time, it's done. It's in its last gasps of being a controlling force here on this planet, you see? Yeah. I mean, this is beautiful stuff. Yeah. Okay, and guess what? The age of Aquarius, the very first conjunction in Aquarius for a long time, is now about to be one step closer. Obviously, it's a very long transition, but this is reason to think that we can make the next step in that direction. You see, because this next conjunction is in Aquarius in 2020. So, in between this alignment of Saturn at the galactic core, that's shooting in some kind of far out energy, right? The center of centers. We may not even realize that we're being sort of like that when the Logos shot that light into the dark matter. after it cried out. Do you think there's some crying out going on in this planet right now, as a matter of fact? Remember, first there was a cry. There was a hey, I yearn for the light. And the light answered. And I think that in my experience, we don't always know when that light answers. We might feel it, but we can't necessarily, like, for instance, when an egg is fertilized, you don't necessarily see it as, the belly swelling for, a month or two at least, yeah? So we might be being impregnated by some cosmic force right now that we may not be fully aware of, that's not going to really show itself until a few years. But this I think is really hopeful, that there's a new wave coming. But the hard part is that it's a two-step It's not just trading one quality and you're there. You got to do the really hard one of going two ways, right? So, because Earth is cold and dry and air is hot and wet. So there's basically two ways to get there. There's the fire way. We can trade cool for hot, and Earth can rub the sticks together and ignite. Yeah? And that's one step closer to air. Then we would have to actually become moist to become air, or we can go the water way. We can exchange dry for moist and become more like water. And I suggest that this has already been happening for the last 20 years since that Taurus conjunction. I think we've actually been working out this transformation from air to earth. Actually, since the 1980, the first conjunction in Libra and air, right? For instance, because I don't necessarily want to get into our politics too much, let's look at the UK. So they had, Europe in general, right? What happened in the 90s? There was the European Union. Now, what does union sound like? Does that sound like dry or moist? It's moist, right? It's union.
Yeah.
It's coming together. Now what's happening?
Fire.
That's right. It's being tested, right? So this union of water is being tested by the dry quality of Brexit is breaking apart. That's separation. That's dryness. You see? So you can look around you and you can say, oh, rather than saying, oh, those, you say, oh, right? You can you see what this tool gives you is that you can dispassionately look at it and say, oh, they're being dry. Yeah? It's not personal. They're being dry. I was on the moist path, but these cats, but these cats are on the dry path. It's possible we could end up in the same place. Yeah? And in fact, did you want to add something? In fact, it's probable we'll end up in the same place because there's really only one place to go there. Even as far apart as they may seem at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah? These opposites, right now, we're stuck. We're kind of like, we're trying to get from earth to air and we're at water and fire. Yeah? We're like, it feels like we're as separate as we could possibly be. Yeah? Doesn't it?
Yeah.
But yet, maybe we actually need to do both of these to really get this transition, right? Because if you do something one time, you go, wow, I actually made it. Was that an accident? Did I really get that? And a lot of times you end up having to do it again, right? Before you really know it, before you really get the whole process. So that it might be that even the people that went the water way the first time around, they might need to understand what that fire way is about, the dry path. In alchemy, there's a dry path and a wet path. You can change one metal into another by burning it and separating out the stuff, or you can change it by introducing an acid, a liquid to, right? So there's both ways are equally valid. And in fact, an alchemist isn't considered a true alchemist unless he's able to perform the operation either way. And the thing is that certain operations would be favored with this path, and certain would be favored with that path.
And Gary, the thing that was called that out was just in these prophetic transmissions about the one age that ended in fire and the age that ended in water.
Right.
It really seems to correlate to.
Yeah, fire and water are the two most powerful elements in terms of their, transformative capabilities, and so we find ourselves actually, moving between two of the gentler elements, but we got to go through the tough ones to get there. You see? So I actually feel like after 2020 with this one, when we start getting into this one, that we're going to see, first of all, I think the internet we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what it could be. I mean, I was talking to Brett the other night, and he knows all these people that are into the whole virtual reality thing, and that's not necessarily my scene. But the fact that you can create a whole nother world, right? Like I said, we're here to create. I believe that Gnostic text basically says that we're creators, just like God and the demiurge. We too are creators. And the fact that we can create these worlds, stick on a pair of glasses, that's pretty amazing, yeah? And if we can take that and apply it to some other things, then I think that would be great. But you can use this in your life to begin to say, okay, where am I cold and dry? Where am I sort of like not active, but kind of like my life is in a static condition, right? Cold is basically static, still. And where am I sort of separate? Where am I sort of separated from things? So cold and dry, what's the cold and dry parts of my life? Yeah. And then you can think about, where could I use some moistness? Where could I use some more togetherness in my life? Where could I just use a little heat? Just, a lot of people say that the whole Brexit vote, the reason people voted for it is just because it was different. It's just, hey, we got to try something. We're tired of being cold, static, stuck in one way. So it's movement. Let's go. Let's just, you see? So it's almost like a lot of times people come to me and they say, well, what should I do? I say, anything but what you're doing now. So, you know what I'm saying? It's like any way you go is going to be better because basically your problem is you're stuck. Okay? So it's really not that difficult, honestly. I mean, this is like the solution to all the problems in the world right now. There's a moist path and there's a dry path. And it's like the key is to understand which path you're on, number one, which path your heart is on, and to understand that someone else who is walking the other path, as opposite as it may be, that maybe they're actually on the way to something that you just don't understand. And it's not your job to understand it. It's your job to do your path, And actually, if you begin to talk to them, if you can, you see, because when you get over here, and you say, wow, I really came from this cold and dry place, and now I'm a little more moist. I have a little bit of more togetherness ability to just like even become one with someone who seems really strange and alien to me, and just say, hey, why do you think the way you do, or whatever. When you become, in this place, in the air and fire can talk. They share a quality. They're both hot. So, well, I want to go, it's there. Well, that's funny. I want to go there too. We're just going about it two very different ways, So, this is basically the map of the philosopher's stone for the world situation and the macrocosm and the microcosm, right? Add the above and the below.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that your heart could be on one path and your brain on another?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's right. And so what you have to figure out is, are you going to let the heart lead and the mind steer? Or are you going to let the mind lead and the heart steer?
Well, can't they get there in different ways?
They can get there in different ways, but I guess her question was, if those two feel like they're on different paths and I feel like I'm getting nowhere, then what do? Let one of them lead. You know?
I mean, it also feels like in some areas of our life we can take the wet path and then others the dry path.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, we can also find ourselves on the fire path. You know, a lot of people with the whole political scene got really fired up and angry and everything. And then they found themselves, you know, saying, oh, you think differently than me, so I'm going to cut ties, you know, I'm going to, you know, defriend a whole bunch of people and stuff. And it's like, wow, you know, then later they realize, wow, you know, all of a sudden, I don't know that feels right anymore. And I've seen people literally go back and go, hey, you know, I'm sorry about that, you know. And I was just upset and whatever, but I wanna reconnect, you know. So you can go, you know, you can go this way, and then you can come back and go this way, you know. You can go both ways. And you can go both ways with the same person, depending on the situation, or with the same, you know. And I'm not sure you don't have to go both ways, because once you go both ways, what's happening is you can get, you know, this, yeah? You can get a correspondence between the above and the below, yeah? So that's a really good question. But I would just suggest that you choose one to lead and let the other steer. Let the other just keep you from getting too far off on that tangent, if you will. So how are we doing on time? Okay. Before I finish here, any questions or other comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, so with Saturn kind of traditionally more associated with Earth and Jupiter more with air, Saturn traditionally is associated as malefic and Jupiter is benefic. Do you feel
or melancholic and sanguine, yeah.
Do you feel that the shift towards the air then will be a lift, a light, like towards...
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's an upward tending element, and this whole idea in the New Age circles of, you know, ascension, it's easy for people actually in the more traditional, and what is Saturn also associated with? Tradition, right? So the people that know this formula that I just shared with you, they're more aligned with like the, you know, the ancient texts of like the Middle Ages and all that, and they hear this New Age stuff about ascension and they go, poo-poo, you know, but, you know, hey, look, we're moving from a downward tending element to an upward tending. So ascension, whether or not it's like actually becoming light beings, I don't know, but it's the right direction. You know what I'm saying? Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Can you go back to the chart so we can see what's happening in 2040?
Libra. The cardinal air sign. So, and this is unrelated, but, and so I can't really get totally into it, but there's another cycle in astrology that I study. It's the Venus-Mars cycle. Remember, they were polar opposites too, right? Hot and dry and cold and moist. And there's a weird thing they do that lasts about 100 years, and it started in 1940s and it ends in the 2040s, where there's that relationships take on a more crazy quality, where it's just sort of it's not really stable. I mean, look at what happened in the 1940s with the people born in the 1940s, you know. They got to college age and free love, and the nuclear family is pretty much extinct now. And now it's even okay to be gay. I mean, think about it. In 1940, we were so far from it being okay to be gay. There's a dramatic change that's happened in terms of. So I think that, in answer to your question, cardinal signs initiate things, initiate movement. I think that it might be until 2040 before we really might come to where a lot of people might say, yeah, we're in like a new thing, right? But that doesn't mean that those of us who know what's up, like literally, can't lead the way. You know, that doesn't mean that we can't start now and lead the way and show the way towards this new way of being, you know? And I think it's both literal, like as I said, I think there's all kinds of possibilities with the internet and with technology and stuff, but it's also here. And it's also here. There's new ways of thinking, and there's new ways of, and you know, getting anything that's sort of static and that separates you. That's the Earth paradigm, right? It's cold and dry. So begin looking around and begin looking around at the ways that you're doing. Because I'm here to tell you, we're all doing it. Yeah. We've been brought up in it. It's in us. As much as we like to say, oh, look at those, so-and-so's doing that, you know, it's in us too. We wouldn't be able to say, look at those so-and-so's if it wasn't in us. Mm-hmm. And when you begin to see how conditioned you are to this sort of static, you know, state of separation, it's really unbelievable. And if you can begin to say, hey, you know what? Maybe there's a better way. Maybe I should try something different. It's like I said, you know, when people come to see me and they're stuck, I don't actually say this, but I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you know, pretty much, what do I do? Where do I go? Anywhere but here, man. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious. I'm really passionate about the concept of coherence. You know, so consciousness.
Yes, ma'am.
So would that fall into also the air?
Yeah.
Because you know that global coherence initiative of like, you know, and heart map where we really emanate from here.
Yes.
And so I mean that's kind of my approach right now is to go from consciousness and to go into coherence with others.
Yes.
To create change. So that's kind of like the internet air, right?
Absolutely, yeah, and that's sort of like the spiritual correlate of, you know, political globalism, if you will. Political globalism is probably here to stay, by the way, right? Because what is it but moist? And this reaction right now that we're seeing in the nationalistic tendencies everywhere is like, it's like that last money grab. It's like that last thing of the dry saying, no, we don't want this togetherness. We want the dry. We want the, and it's like, yeah, I don't know. I don't think you can get it too much longer, honestly. And what you're saying is kind of the, you know, that coherence, that moistness, that togetherness, that you know, that quality of oneness and unity and all that. Yeah, absolutely. That's a feature of air. It's hot. It's active. It's actively seeking coherence. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So actively seeking togetherness.
And that would give hope for sacred economics as well, then.
Yes, the sharing economy. And I mean, honestly, you know, what you can do that I think is really positive with the earth, you know, being, excuse me, there we go. With earth being, you know, cold and dry, if there's something that really offends your sensibilities to the degree, you know, dry, separate, don't give your money to it, you know, boycott it, right? So rather than like, to me, rather than saying, you know, oh, how dare you, you know, I mean, that's hot, so it's okay. But to me, like just saying, man, not my trip, like I'm going the other way, you know, and just dispassionately, you know, separating from and giving your money to like, you know, cool people, man. It seems pretty simple, but yeah, I mean, giving your money to things you actually believe in and that feels good in your heart, and I mean, that's how we create a new economy. Because they, whoever they are not going to do it for us, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we got to do it with each other. We've got to come into coherence with the people that we actually believe in and that we, you know, want to be one with.
And that's how we create the new world.
Absolutely. That's always how it's happened. Yeah. Good point. Anything I covered that anybody wants to hear a little bit more about, or anything I didn't cover that anybody wants to ask about?
Well, when you do readings for people on a more like micro personal, like this is about you,
Yes.
your story. You've said a couple of times you just tell people
Yeah.
do anything that's
So
not
basically, you can talk about these as 4 ways of being. I tell people a lot of times the best astrology book I ever read is not an astrology book at all. It's called let's see, it's by Carol Pearson. It's about hero archetypes. I can't think of the name right now. I think it's called The Hero Within. The Hero Within, yeah.
It's from the 80s, I think.
Yeah. Really great book. And she talks about hey, look, slaying a dragon is not the only way to be a hero. Being a mother is being heroic. I mean, think about the heroic struggle it just takes to bring a being into this world. And then caring for it for 18 years, and God only knows it's more like 30-some years now. You know? And that's a heroic. So she calls that the altruist or the healer. That's the water way of being a hero. Yeah? And then the air way she calls the wanderer, go on a quest. Yeah, like so Parsifal was searching for the Grail castle so that he could say to the Fisher King, you know, who does the Grail serve? That's the key to who does the Grail serve? Where is really the power of creation, right? Where is it serving these cats that we call authorities, or is it serving God? Right? That was the key in that trip. And then if you got fire as the classic warrior that slays dragons, or you know, injustice or whatever. And earth, she calls the magician hero, which is about adopting best practices. So if you're like an artist that says, hey, I see this person over here doing something cool, and I see that person doing something cool, and you bring those 2 things together, that's like, so basically what I'm hearing almost all the time is people coming to me and saying, yeah, I've been doing this caretaking thing for 30 years. And again, pick one of the other 3 and go, man. You know? I mean, I know it sounds silly, but it's really that simple. The easiest ones, of course, would be earth and air. But you know, if you want to get to fire, you got to go through one of those 2. Yeah?
Do you apply like those principles from like planetary body perspective?
Absolutely.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's so simple, you know, and yet so powerful. But yeah, that's basically all there is. You can do an astrology reading with just basically these 4, and you can change somebody's life. Well, you can help somebody change their life, right? Yeah, it's really that. I mean, I've seen people who were like really sort of. One lady came to me and she was like, yeah, you know, she had a really strong Jupiter in her chart, for instance. Remember, Jupiter is hot and moist, right? But she was kind of isolated and kind of shy. And I told her, I said, look, you know, this is what Jupiter normally looks like, and you've got it really strong in your chart, but I don't see, you know, you doing any of that. So I'm thinking like you weren't very encouraged, and oh no, that was very frowned upon. Okay, so in psychology, you hear this word projection, right? And it's always kind of a negative word, right? Oh, so-and-so's projecting on me. Well, guess what? We're monkeys. That's how we learn, is through projection, yeah? So what did she have to do? I said, well, hey, here's what Jupiter looks like, right? Watch for those kind of people in your life. And when you see them, hang out with them. And when you hang out with them, you'll find your inner Jupiter. I know you will. She called me up a few months later. Hey, you were right. I met this really cool college professor, and we're hanging out. And I think he wants to date me, but he hasn't said so yet. Another month later, yeah, we're dating now. Oh, now we're traveling to Europe together. Oh, now we're living in Europe. So you see, it was only through projection onto this professor guy that she found her inner Jupiter and became this, you know, international traveler. Yes, sir.
So if I can kind of summarize in my own mind, both of you guys,
we're in this transitional period till 2020 when the newer influences these are ancient celestial and elemental alchemy kind of influences are shifting to Aquarius and water.
Air.
Air.
Yes.
Air. All right.
We're getting lighter.
Yes.
So yeah, the thing that I'm talking about is this long cycle, right?
Oh, sure.
I mean, almost
Yeah.
like too long for us to really tune
Yeah.
into. I mean, it's like the myth of creation, you know?
Yeah.
And so these cycles come in to lead the way. And I feel like there's kind of an inhale and an exhale to it. And we're kind of inhaling to Earth like these last 80 years since this galactic alignment really started. And now we're going to breathe that out. Like Gary said, there's, you know, it's like there's this mystical rebirthing happening. There's literally like physical mechanisms recommended for, or suggested that could be this cause of this enlightening that so many of us are tuning into.
So the age of Aquarius is in air.
Yes.
Aquarius is an air sign. It's a water bearer. He's carrying a pitcher.
Yeah.
But think about it. Why is he carrying a pitcher? He's bringing water, you know, from the water source back to the community. It's an air sort of, you know, there's a travel, you know. So it's an air. I know it's a little counterintuitive. He's the water bearer, but he's an air sign. Yeah.
And the glyphs are these waves, but right, this is chi and ki
It's
and
consciousness,
and ba and
yeah.
prana, numos, you know, like
Right.
energy waves, conscious waves.
So the water is really the spiritual consciousness that he's pouring out is really spiritual consciousness. And that's, I think, why, you know, so that he's dunking his water on the fish.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like a baptism.
In this next epic, the planet that is influencing, is it Saturn or Jupiter?
Saturn this year, Jupiter in a couple.
Yeah.
So I kind of just feel like they come and bring their own essence. Like Saturn, who brings, as Gary said, grounding, wisdom, tradition. That's why I said this prayer. Like I hope John Major Jenkins' work like comes into ground. People see this, so we can really start tapping into these old transmissions. Like it can really come into form. Where Jupiter will lift us up, and that one's in 2019.
Yeah.
So the eclipses intrigue me because that's like all those dragons, all those crosses coming together.
And your elemental cycles sort of concur with his.
Yeah, absolutely. This is sort of the microcosm to the macrocosm.
Yeah.
He's talking about the really long-term cycles, and I'm like, hey, what can we do right now or for the next few years, you know?
Right, like if this is happening, how can we tap into it? And how can we tap into it with visible lights, right? So
Yeah.
you can see, like...
That we'll see in just a few minutes here.
No, I have this question, Gary. So
Yeah.
we're moving through the elements kind of zodiacally, sequentially, right? From the earth to the air to the water to the fire. So every 200 years per element, and it's like every 400 years we get the hard one where we have to cross
Yes,
to the
that's
opposite, right?
That's
So
right.
air will go to water in 200 years, and that's like easier because it's next to it.
Right,
But then water will go to fire, and we'll have to jump.
right.
So even in this 800-year period of 200,
There's two easy ones and two
400s.
difficult ones. Yeah, we happen to be at one of the difficult ones, as you can tell by walking out the door. Yeah.
So that would say 200 years ago was an easy one. That'd be a fun thing to kind of...
Yeah, it's. I mean, the thing about astrology is, you know, there's so many disciplines that it cross-pollinates with. As I said, I mean, you can go back and you can look at, you know, so the last airwave was the Renaissance, and then before that it was Alexander the Great, and so on, you know, and then you can begin to look at these transitions and what happened, and it's just absolutely fascinating. I mean, Richard Tarnas wrote a book about that thick. It's called Cosmos and Psyche, using the outer planets. But nobody's ever done a book on this, which I think is, I mean, to me, this cycle with Jupiter and Saturn through the elements, that would be, I would love to see somebody do just what you're saying and go ahead and do all that research. Yes, sir.
I hear if you say you wish someone would do it, it's not out there, then you're the one who gets to do it.
Well, my buddy Kelly Lee Phipps, actually, I borrowed from his book here. He did like an e-book. And he is, and you know, so it's like, you know, 60 pages. It's like a mini book. The thing that would keep me from doing this book is that I'm already under contract to do 3 books on Mercury, and I've only published one of them, so I've got 2 more. That doesn't mean I can't do it. I mean, it might not be by 2020, but as I said, I mean, 2020 is just sort of the beginning, you know. it'll be, this will be pretty much once we, this is the rest of our lives, and the rest of, how many generations is that? That's like lots.
Yeah,
So
this last cycle, it's like come down into form, the understanding, the remembering of it, right? And the earth cycle, and now the air cycle is also when we transmit it, right? Because air is part of the way of communication.
Yeah. So, thanks so much for coming out, y'all. I appreciate it.
I'm not going to sing happy birthday to you because my voice.
Oh, thank God.
But yeah, I just want to thank Gary again for coming down. Thank you guys so much for coming out. I have this this thing that I say about Jupiter and Saturn because they can feel so opposite, like there's this war. But if you think of our path as like a hot air balloon to the heavens, Jupiter is the air that lifts you, but we would go nowhere without Saturn because he's the last visible light. He's the skin of the solar system. He's the fabric of the balloon. And there, where the air meets the fabric, it feels like a war, but really they're in it together to lift us up, And I think that we're feeling a lot of that, seeing a lot of that in our world right now. And if we can bring that perspective also, it really helps me see some of the things that are so painful and negative for me. And
this
saying,
tension between the opposites. Yeah, that's what Carl Jung said. That's where all growth occurs. Rather than become reactive and say, no, I want to be in this pole and that opposite thing can go away. Like, no, you have to have the hot air and the container to actually fly. Yeah, you have to bring those opposites together. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
We're gonna go outside and do some stargazing now.
Yeah, I'm gonna shut down, pack some stuff up, but maybe in about 10 or 15 minutes we'll be up on the observation deck, which there's just stairs to, and we'll look at some stars and planets together and key into the directions and do some fun things and fully open to questions or whatever up there too. So thanks again so much for coming out, and we hope to see you next time around. If you didn't sign that list, please do, because we'll be emailing links to see these movies and see you again. Alrighty. And you can check out Gary at dreamastrologer.com. Hermetic Astrology Podcast is amazing. Check it out. And you can find me at morethan astrology.com. Or on the observation deck in like 10 minutes.